The alert came through at 6:47 in the morning, while I was still in bed. It was a Chase notification, the kind that usually means a direct deposit hit or a bill auto-paid. I almost swiped it away, but the amount stopped me. $312,000, and the note next to it said, "Property sale disbursement. Clearwater Lake RD." I sat up so fast I knocked my water glass off the nightstand. That was my grandfather's address. That was the address on the deed my grandfather had put in my name 3 years before he died. My name is Sloane. I was 31 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, working as a dental hygienist, and I had just received confirmation that someone had sold a piece of property I owned, without my knowledge, without my signature, without a single phone call. I want to back up, because if I don't give you the full picture, none of this makes sense. My grandfather, my mom's dad, built a cabin on Clearwater Lake Road in central Michigan when my mom was 12 years old. He did most of it himself, weekends and summers with 2 neighbors and a lot of stubbornness. It wasn't fancy. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that needed replacing every decade or so. But it was ours. Every 4th of July, every Thanksgiving that we could manage, every random summer weekend when Grandpa decided the fish were biting. I learned to swim off that dock. My brother broke his wrist jumping off the roof of that dock. It smelled like cedar and bug spray and lake water, and even describing it now I can feel that specific kind of calm that only exists in places you loved before you knew to appreciate them. When my grandmother passed, I was 22. My grandfather changed his will. He was deliberate about it. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd made too strong, the way he always did, and he told me he wanted the cabin to stay in the family, but he didn't trust that it would if he left it to everyone equally. He'd watched his brother's lake house get sold off 6 months after the brother died because nobody could agree on what to do with it. He didn't want that for our cabin. He said, "I'm putting it in your name because I trust you to keep it for everyone." He had a real estate attorney draft a transfer on death deed. It was clean, it was legal, it was recorded with the county. When he died 2 years later, the cabin passed to me directly. No probate, no waiting. It was mine. My mother knew this. She had sat at that same kitchen table and heard it from him directly. She had also, at some point in the 18 months before that Chase alert, decided it didn't matter. Here's what I pieced together. Not all at once, but over the following days as I made calls, pulled records, and tried not to vomit every time I thought about it. My mother had been telling people, her sister, a few of her friends, my brother, that the cabin was a burden, that the property taxes were coming up, that maintenance was getting expensive, and that I didn't use it enough to justify holding on to it. None of this was true. I'd been up there 3 times the previous summer, but the narrative was already set before she came to me. She came to me about 8 months before the sale. We were on the phone. She's in Saginaw, I'm in Columbus. And she brought up the cabin. She said she'd heard the lake property values were up, that it might be a good time to sell if I ever thought about it. I told her I didn't think about it. I told her the cabin wasn't something I wanted to sell, probably ever. She said she understood. She said, of course, it's yours." She said that, "It's yours." What I didn't know was that she'd already started talking to a real estate agent in Roscommon County. What I didn't know was that she'd told the agent she had authority to act on my behalf. What I didn't know was that she had found a power of attorney document, one my grandfather had drafted when he was sick, and she was handling some of his medical decisions, and was using it to represent herself as my authorized agent. That power of attorney was for my grandfather's affairs. It had terminated upon his death. It had nothing to do with me, and even if it had, it would have been expired. But apparently someone didn't look closely enough, or looked and didn't care, and the sale went through. $312,000. Split as far as I could tell between my mother's checking account and a vacation fund she'd set up for my brother's family to go to Costa Rica. My brother, for what it's worth, claims he didn't know where the money came from. I don't know if I believe that. I stared at that notification for a long time. Then I called my best friend Petra. She picked up on the second ring. She's a morning person. I've never understood it. And I just said, someone sold my cabin. And she said, what? And I said, I need you to help me figure out what to do. Petra works in commercial insurance. She's not a lawyer, but she knows how to find information fast, and within an hour, she was texting me names of real estate attorneys in the Columbus area who handled fraud cases. I know a lot of people would have called their mother first, would have assumed there was some kind of mistake, some miscommunication, something that could be explained. I'm not going to pretend I was completely rational. Part of me did think, maybe for about 45 seconds, that there had to be an explanation. Maybe some paperwork had gotten crossed. Maybe someone at the county had made an error. Maybe. But then I thought about that conversation 8 months ago. It's yours. Said with so much certainty. Said like a reassurance. People don't reassure you about things unless they're already thinking about taking them. I found an attorney named, well, I'll call her my attorney, because she's asked me not to use her name publicly, and I respect that. She had short gray hair and red glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and she did not waste time. I brought her everything I had, the transfer on death deed, my grandfather's death certificate, the county recording showing the property in my name, and the chase alert. She pulled up the sale record herself while I sat across from her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, the power of attorney they used, do you have a copy of it? I didn't, but she found one through the county clerk's office within 2 days. It was the document from when my grandfather was alive. My mother's name was on it as his agent, not mine. It had a termination clause that activated at death. It was, as my attorney put it with clinical precision, worthless for this transaction. She also explained something to me that I hadn't fully understood before, and that I think about a lot when I see people in the comments asking why the sale wasn't just automatically voided. When a property is sold fraudulently, the law doesn't automatically reverse it, especially when there's a third-party buyer who may have purchased in good faith. The buyers, a couple from Grand Rapids, likely had no idea there was anything wrong. They used a title company, they got title insurance, they closed in good faith. Getting the property back would require litigation, would take years potentially, and might not succeed because the buyers are protected under bona fide purchaser rules if they genuinely didn't know about the fraud. What my attorney said we could pursue aggressively was the money, full restitution of the sale proceeds, damages for the loss of a unique asset, a referral to the state of Michigan's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. Because my mother, I learned that week, had a real estate license she'd gotten a few years back, apparently as a side hustle. I had not known that either. My attorney drafted a letter. It wasn't long. It laid out the facts, the invalid power of attorney, the fraudulent representation, the unauthorized sale of titled property, and it gave my mother and everyone involved 72 hours to respond with a plan for full restitution before we filed in civil court and referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for potential criminal fraud charges. Then she sent it. I didn't call my mother before the letter arrived. I know that might seem cold. But I had already played the conversation in my head 100 times, and I knew exactly how it would go. She would cry. She would say she'd done it for the family. She would find a way to make me the one who was being unreasonable. I'd watched her do it my whole life. Reframe, redirect. Make the person she'd hurt into the person causing the problem. I wasn't going to give her the chance to do that before I had legal representation standing behind me. My brother called me the day the letter arrived. I knew it was him before I even looked at the phone, because he only ever called, not texted, when something was wrong and he needed me to fix it or take the blame for it. Sloane, he said, and his voice had that tight quality. What is this letter? I said, it's exactly what it says it is. He said, you can't be serious, it was just a cabin. That sentence, it was just a cabin. I said, it was my cabin. He said, Mom was trying to help. The property taxes were due. There were repairs needed. I said, the taxes were $3,000 a year and the repairs were a new water heater. I know, because I paid for both of them. He went quiet. I said, I told her 8 months ago I didn't want to sell. She sold it anyway and you went to Costa Rica. He said he hadn't known where the money came from, which, again, I don't know. Maybe. But he'd cashed the check or received the transfer or however it worked, and he hadn't asked questions. And at a certain point, not asking questions is its own kind of answer. We didn't talk for a while after that call. My mother called me about 4 hours after my brother did. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was, I'll be honest, hard to listen to. She said she was sorry. She said she'd made a mistake. She said she thought she was doing what was best for everyone and that she'd hoped the money would make up for it. She'd planned to give me my share, but she'd needed the rest for some things, which she didn't specify. She said she didn't realize the power of attorney wasn't valid anymore. I don't know if that last part is true. I've gone back and forth on it. The document had a clear termination clause. But she's not a lawyer, and maybe she genuinely didn't understand the legal implications. I've thought about this more than I probably should. What I know is that I didn't realize doesn't give back a cabin. My attorney filed the civil complaint when my mother didn't respond formally within the 72 hours. She also filed the complaint with Lara, the licensing board, and sent the packet to the Roscommon County Prosecutor's Office. My mother's attorney reached out within a week of the civil filing. They wanted to settle. They said my mother acknowledged the error, their word, error, and was prepared to discuss restitution. We negotiated for about 3 weeks. It wasn't simple, partly because of the question my brother's friend asked in the comments that I see a lot of people echoing online. What if she doesn't have the money? She'd spent a significant portion. My brother's family had gone on the trip. There were expenses. Here's what happened, and I want to be clear about this because I've seen people assume it gets tied up neatly. It didn't. Not entirely. My mother liquidated a retirement account. She paid me $280,000, not the full $312,000 because some portion had been designated as her commission, in a way that was legally murky and would have cost more to fight than it was worth. I also received a signed acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a formal apology that I had my attorney review before I accepted. My brother repaid his portion, about $22,000, on a structured plan. That one was simpler because his wife has a good job and they weren't going to let this become a lawsuit. The Lara complaint resulted in my mother's real estate license being suspended pending investigation. I don't know the final outcome of that because it's an ongoing administrative process, and I'm honestly not monitoring it closely anymore. The criminal referral, the prosecutor reviewed it and declined to file charges, which I know will frustrate people. Their reasoning was essentially that the civil settlement indicated this was being handled adequately, and that intent was difficult to establish conclusively, given the murkiness around whether she genuinely believed the power of attorney was valid. I'm not satisfied with that, but it's where it landed. I did not get the cabin back. That's the part I've had to sit with. The buyers are living there. They're probably fixing it up, putting their own things on the walls, teaching their own kids to swim off that dock. And I try not to think about it too hard because when I do I feel something that doesn't have a clean name. Not quite grief, not quite anger, somewhere between them. What I got was money, and accountability in some form. And clarity about something I'd spent my whole life suspecting and never letting myself fully believe. There's a version of my family that I grew up wanting to be real. The one where my mom was a little scattered but fundamentally in my corner. The one where my brother was selfish but not complicit. The one where things that were mine were safe with the people who loved me. I've stopped trying to live in that version. About 2 months after the settlement, I used part of the money to make a down payment on a small house. Not a cabin, not on a lake, just a house in a neighborhood I like with a yard I can make into something. I got a dog. Her name is Biscuit, and she is not well behaved, and I love her completely. I set up a consultation with an estate planning attorney to make sure everything I have is documented, titled, and recorded in a way that leaves no room for anyone to decide on my behalf. And I stopped explaining myself to people who ask why I've stepped back from my family. I used to have a whole speech about it. Now I just say it's complicated, and I leave it there. There are things I know now that I wish I'd known before. If you have property in your name, whether it came from an inheritance or a gift or anything else, please know that a transfer on death deed, While excellent protection against probate doesn't make you immune to someone misrepresenting authority over your assets during your lifetime. Get title monitoring on any property you own. Most counties offer it free or for a small fee. It sends you an alert anytime a document is recorded against your property. I would have known something was wrong months earlier if I'd had that. Know who has power of attorney over what and when it expires. Know that a POA granted to someone for one person's affairs doesn't transfer to yours. Know that title companies can miss things. They do it more often than people realize, and their responsibility is to the transaction, not to you personally. Keep copies of everything. My grandfather kept a blue binder with every document related to that cabin: the deed, the surveys, the tax records, the photos of the original build. He gave it to me when he transferred the property. I still have it. I'll always have it. I can't get back the place, but I have the record of everything it was. And some mornings, when it's quiet and Biscuit is asleep on my feet and the light comes through the kitchen window at a certain angle, I let myself remember exactly what it felt like to be 12 years old on that dock, watching the sun come up over the water. Before anyone had taken anything, before I knew they could. That part's still mine. I keep coming back to the blue binder. My grandfather put every document about that cabin in one place: the deed, the surveys, the tax records, old photographs of the original framing going up. He handed it to me like it was something sacred because to him it was. He wasn't a sentimental man in the way people usually mean. He didn't make speeches. But he built something with his hands and he chose me to keep it, and that binder was his way of saying, "This matters, and so do you." What I've had to reckon with, in the months since all of this happened, is that the people who took that cabin from me didn't just take property. They took a decision that wasn't theirs to make, and the way they did it, quietly. While I was living my life and trusting that the things in my name were safe, that's what I can't quite let go of. Not the money. Not even the cabin. The assumption that my trust was something they could use. Actions have weight. That sounds simple. But I think most people don't really believe it until they're standing in the middle of the consequences. My mother made a choice. She told herself a story about why it was reasonable, the taxes, the upkeep, the idea that I didn't appreciate it enough. And she acted on that story without once asking me if it was true. And then the consequences came, the way they always do. Not as punishment from some outside force, but as the natural result of what she'd set in motion. A fraudulent sale doesn't stay hidden. A forged authorization doesn't hold up. What you do in the dark still happened. I think about what it took to get through this, and I don't think it was one thing. It was three things working together, and I didn't have all three of them fully until I needed them. The first was knowing right from wrong and refusing to let someone else's rationalization become mine. My mother had a story. My brother had a story. I could have accepted their version, that it was complicated, that she'd meant well, that the money was close enough to justice. That would have been easier. I chose not to, because I knew what had actually happened, and I wasn't willing to call it something smaller to keep the peace. The second was understanding the situation clearly enough to act on it. I called Petra. I found an attorney. I read every document. I asked questions until I understood the answers. That's not something that came naturally to me. I'm not someone who grew up thinking about property law or estate planning. But I learned fast, because I had to, because the alternative was losing everything and having no idea why. Clarity isn't something that just arrives. You have to go get it. The third was staying in it when it was hard, when my brother called and his voice had that edge. When my mother left that voicemail and I had to decide whether to soften. When the prosecutor declined to file charges and I had to accept that justice doesn't always look the way you want it to. I stayed in it. I didn't shrink. Sloane, who sat on that dock at 12 years old, didn't know any of this was coming. But I think she'd recognize the person who came out the other side. A little steadier. A little less willing to make herself small for people who weren't careful with her. Biscuit is asleep on the couch next to me while I write this. The yard needs mowing. The house is mine. That's enough.